How you doing, guys? This is Matthias Atva from Dee Rek Dreadnought, your Dreadnought PS4 replay guy. It's Sunday, so instead of posting one of my awesome replays, I'm posting part 1 in a 4-part series on Dreadnought Officer Briefings. Before we start, I wanted to say that Officer Briefings are an important part of the Dreadnought game, but they are no substitution for solid gameplay techniques, good teamwork, or well thought out module builds that complements your gameplay style. Officer Briefings aren't the magic cookies that will transform your Dreadnought gameplay experience into an elite noob slaughter farm. Think of Officer Briefings as the icing on the cake, that little thing in Dreadnought that gives players who grind them out a slight edge on those who don't. A player with good officer briefings and crappy game technique and poor module ship builds will lose against a good player with all 101 officer briefings every time. However, a player with officer briefings that complements their build will have a serious edge on a player with an identical ship build that hasn't put in the time to obtain officer briefings. Before you grind out ships you may not like in order to get their officer briefings, know that becoming familiar with your favorite ships and getting the modules you want on those ships is the fastest way to becoming a better Dreadnought player. That being said, I do want to add that I have a slight bias when it comes to officer briefings. I do prefer briefings that are less conditional and require less work on your part to achieve nice results. I'm also a big fan of a couple of the 101 officer briefings, and before you go off chasing officer briefing waterfall fantasies, you should realize how effective and efficient some of the 101 briefings really are. Okay, so let's dive in. Today we're going to take a look at communications officer briefings, how they work, how to get them and where to find them, and how they are currently being used in the Dreadnought gameplay meta. First, let's take a look at Communications 101. Unlike other 101 officer briefings like Navigation 101, I think this briefing is the second worst in the game. Just awful. Communications 101 seems simple enough. It reduces your module cooldowns by 10%, but what the game doesn't tell you is that this is rounded down. This means that it will reduce your cooldown by 1 second for every 10 seconds the module needs to cool down. So for a 60-second module, it reduces the cooldown by 6 seconds. For a 25-second cooldown, it only reduces the cooldown by 2 seconds, a 15-second cooldown by only 1 second, and for something like evasive maneuver, this officer briefing has no effect. Compared to the dramatic effects of the other officer briefings in the communications category, this officer briefing is hardly worth it, and it is the first officer briefing on your ships that you should look to replace. Next, let's take a look at the only communications officer briefing available at Tier 3, my favorite in the game, Feedback Loop. Feedback Loop is a fantastic briefing that works passively, gives you a huge advantage in the game, and is very easy to grind to and obtain. We find it on the Tier 3 Tactical Cruiser Palos in the Jupiter Arms tree. Feedback Loop triggers when one of your modules comes off cooldown. When it does, you gain 0.3 energy for every second of cooldown. That may not sound like a lot at first, but it means you gain 1/3 of the cooldown's time back as energy. That means when a 60-second cooldown, like storm missiles, is finished, you gain 20 power. Even evasive maneuver, which you can use in theory every 4 seconds, will give you 1 power every time you use it. Even a relatively low cooldown, like afterburner, will give you 5 power every time you use it. This can certainly add up, and also has hidden benefits you may not have thought of. Feedback Loop is a good soft counter to Drain Pulse and Drain Missiles. Even if your energy bar has been disabled by these effects, Feedback Loop will still award you the appropriate amount of power, which may come in very handy in a desperate situation. Feedback Loop is also a soft counter to Disruptor Module effects. If someone Drain Pulses and Disruptor Missiles you, those 10 seconds added to your module cooldowns are counted by Feedback Loop. That means that even in a bad or inconvenient game situation, you are still getting bonus power you can use for shields or to engines in order for you to get away. Overall, this is a fantastic officer briefing that is easy to get, requires very little grinding experience, and will give you tangible benefits that far outweigh shaving a couple seconds off your cooldown times with Communications 101. Now, let's take a look at the other Jupiter Arms Communications Officer briefing, Retaliator. Retaliator can be found on the Tier 4 Jutland Dreadnought in the Jupiter Arms tech tree. This is considered the staple Dreadnought Communications briefing. If you like Dreadnoughts, then you want this officer briefing. Retaliator reduces your cooldowns by a small percent every time your shields take damage. At first, this seems like Communication 101, but with conditions, which may not be very effective. But if you captain a ship and rarely turn on your shields, then this may be true, and you may want to consider searching for another communications briefing. But if you find yourself slugging it out with other ships, constantly having your shields pounded by enemy fire, then the effects Retaliator has on your cooldowns can be dramatic and amazing. Every time your shields takes a minor hit from random gunfire, all your cooldowns are reduced by 1 second. And if that gunfire is constant, your cooldowns are constantly being reduced by that 1 second. If you turn on your shields to absorb a nuke or something strong like a powerful barrage of storm missiles, all your cooldowns will be reduced by up to 10 seconds in one hit. For Dreadnoughts, Akula destroyers, or even a combat tactical like the Jupiter Arms Tax, who like sitting in the middle of a firefight and trading blows of multiple enemies, Retaliator will see your modules cool down twice as fast, maybe even more. Getting to the Jupiter Arms Jutland may take some time, but it's just as much grind for other Tier 4 officer briefings, and if you find yourself constantly using your shields for most of a Dreadnought match, this is the officer briefing you should be striving for. Next, let's take a look at Desperate Measures. Desperate Measures is a Tier 4 communications officer briefing found in the Muramat's artillery cruiser in the Akula Vector line. At first glance, this briefing doesn't seem like much, but for certain ship classes who like to avoid taking damage, this is another essential officer briefing. Desperate Measures triggers when your ship's hull is reduced to 25% or less and only triggers once per respawn, which may sound like a huge downfall, but this is to avoid clever game exploiters from abusing this powerful briefing. Once at 25%, Desperate Measures removes all debuffs from your ship, such as Scramble, Drain, Disruption, etc., then fills your energy bar to full, and then immediately cools down all of your modules to make them available. This all happens instantly as soon as you reach the 25% damage threshold. This briefing is perfect for long-range artillery cruisers who spend most of the match out of harm's way and want to survive sudden ambushes from corvettes or destroyers. This briefing pairs well with artillery armor amplifier, anti-missile modules, flechettes and missile modules, and many others. This briefing isn't just for artillery either. It works well with ambushers like corvettes and Vindictas. With these ambush attack ships, you can sneak up, burn all of your modules and energy on an attack, and if your attack fails, when things get desperate, you can get a sudden boost of energy and modules to either escape or finish the job you started. This briefing can also be used on kamikaze builds. One kamikaze build that is popular in the current Dreadnought meta is the Quadruple Missile Torp build. Simply load up your favorite destroyer with storm missiles, Goliath torpedoes, flechettes, or even drain and scramble pulses, and most importantly, load it up with the Module Reboot mod and Desperate Measures. Then fly into a group of enemies like lambs to the slaughter. Unload on your first target, hit Module Reboot, and go kill a second target, and then when everyone else decides you're annoying and wants to kill you, Desperate Measures will kick in and you can attack and kill up to 2 more targets. I've seen a destroyer launch 3 or even 4 sets of storm missiles and flechettes before they finally go down. Fun times indeed. And finally, we have the niche briefing in the Communications Officer Briefing category, Module Recycler. Module Recycler is an interesting briefing with some clever uses found on the Lorica Tier 4 Dreadnought in the Oberon manufacturing tree. Module Recycler will reduce all of your module cooldowns by 15 seconds every time you kill an enemy using a module. Well, that seems rather specific and conditional, and for many ships this may be a briefing you want to pass up, especially if you're not a fan of grinding through Oberon ships. However, if you find yourself killing most of your targets with your modules and don't depend on gunfire, then this briefing can have a dramatic effect on your gameplay and seeing you hit double kills left and right. Take for example Plasma Ram, Assault Blink Warp, or even Blast Pulsed and Plasma Broadside. Module Recycler is essential for destroyers or corvettes that use ambush ram techniques, as it will reduce the cooldown of your most potent weapons to 10 or even 5 seconds every time you kill an enemy. I have seen skilled players ram or warp through entire ship formations, getting 3 to 4 kills before they die or are forced to retreat. This module can also aid in escape, as after you get your kill, if things get too hot, your warp jump or afterburner modules will get the 15-second cooldown bonus too, and you will be able to make a hasty escape. A word to the wise, before you start dreaming of being an unstoppable juggernaut, this briefing requires a lot of skill to use, and if you find yourself killing most of your enemies with guns, or your kills are more steady and less frequent, this briefing will not help your game at all. Even though this briefing is found on a Dreadnought and seems like it might pair well with Plasma Broadside, if you're a Dreadnought captain, I highly suggest you take a look at Retaliator instead. Well, that concludes my review on the Dreadnought Communications Officer Briefings. I hope it helped you in deciding what communications briefings you may want instead of the awful Communications 101, and it saved you some time, effort, and disappointment. Stay tuned next week for part 2 of our Officer Briefing overview. If you know someone who is relatively new to the game and has questions about Officer Briefings, and you don't want to spend a half an hour explaining it to them, please share them a link to this video. Also have them check out my 5 tips to make you a better Dreadnought player on my YouTube channel, Dee Rek Dreadnought. Well, that's it from me for now, and I'll see you soon in Sinley Bay.